It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm happy to share some of the information, building on what my colleagues have shared this morning. As you can see, I'm going to be speaking mostly about taking an individual athlete, customizing what they're doing, what they need, and then providing a solution for them. Specifically, I'm going to give some football examples towards the end. Yesterday morning, if you were here, Dr. Munir spoke about 1%. Can we find 1%? Especially when you're talking about an elite athlete, if you can get that 1%, that's going to make a difference. I'd like to share some pictures. I was at the London Olympics a couple years ago, and this is the women's triathlon. I had to have triathlon in here because it's my favorite sport. But this is a picture I took a couple hundred meters from the finish line. So you can see there are 4 women here. There are 3 medals, so unfortunately one of these women is not going to get a medal. But it's amazing to see after competing for 2 hours, a couple hundred meters, and we're coming down to one of these people getting the gold, silver, bronze, and out of the medals. If you know the results of this competition, unfortunately, at least for me, the USA female did not medal out of this group. But I wanted to show a picture from the actual finish line that was taken in this race. So this was the photo finish for gold or silver medal. And you can see here, competing for 2 hours, if you can have any small advantage at all, it could come down to a different medal. Now, obviously, it's amazing for both of these women to be on the podium at the Olympics, and I'm sure it's a lifelong dream, and they trained for many, many years and focused on the Olympics for London for the 4-year cycle. But even from this picture, I couldn't even tell which one of these women were the one that won. It is such a close, it was actually won by centimeters, they had the same time, but you can see that any small advantage is going to be welcomed by an elite athlete. Laura has talked about our mission, and as she discussed, it's really about us helping performance, helping health, and with the athlete in mind, so the athlete is always first. And we do both tests in the lab, as was described just before in Sam's talk, but we also do many tests in the field, and you'll see a mixture of those that Laura has described, and then some of the results that we see in those tests. So Gatorade's been around for 50 years now. Even from the beginning, it was based on an athletic need. There were American football players competing in the very hot Florida sun. There was dehydration. There were issues with cramping with these players. There were issues with their nutritional status during the race. So a scientist, Dr. Cade, actually developed a solution, developed what is Gatorade to help specifically these athletes. A few years later, as Lourdes mentioned, the Gatorade Sport Science Institute was formed. It started actually as an exercise physiology lab with a very focused labs, but then a few years later expanded into many different labs. So in the lab that Lourdes showed up in Chicago and Barrington, just outside of Chicago, we have many different labs located there. Lourdes also shared our 3 main pillars, and today I'm really going to be talking about the service, and education always goes along with service, so it's not just working with the athlete and understanding them, it's also providing the information that they need directly to the athlete, to the coaches, to the medical team that's working with them as well. When we think of an athlete, it's very important to understand their characteristics. We like to think that every athlete is different. We need to study the athlete to see what are those characteristics. These are just some of the ones that we look at. Today I'm mostly going to be speaking about the sweat type and the metabolic profile, and Lourdes kind of prefaced that earlier this morning. I'll speak also very briefly about nutrition preferences, and Sam also spoke about physical characteristics prior to this talk. I'm not going to talk about that, but just wanted to mention, if you're thinking of American football linemen, as he showed the picture of, that is maybe 150, 160 kilos, or a gymnast that's maybe 40 kilos, that's a very big difference, and very big difference in the needs of these types of athletes. It's important to understand what is the sport that the athlete is actually competing in. So we see in football that it's made up of many very short sprints, so very high intensity sprints, and we know that the muscles are actually using mainly carbohydrate in this type of an effort. And when you're using a lot of fuel during exercise, unfortunately we're not 100% efficient, and we end up generating heat, so that's a byproduct of the utilization and production of energy. So to cool ourselves, we're going to be sweating. In that process, we're losing fluid and electrolytes. Without replacing those, as I'll discuss, we can run into some particular issues in competition. So when we think about carbohydrate intake in football specifically, I'm not going into a lot of research today. Typically, I'm giving scientific presentations, but today really just broadly wanted to make some statements regarding some research that's been done. Carbohydrate needs and providing carbohydrate in footballers has shown to improve skill specifically, or maintain skill specifically towards the end of matches or later in training. So it's not just carbohydrate, but we think about fluid. This particular study was looking at a squad of professional players and found that on average they were losing about 4 liters during this session. However, they were only replacing a little over a liter, so less than half of that. These athletes were becoming dehydrated, and we know from research, prior research, that dehydration will actually result in decrements in performance. So you can see some of the skills here that would decrease with the athlete. All right, so maybe some of you are waiting for this portion, specifically what we were doing with the Brazilian national team. But several years ago, we started working with the team and actually had a scientist, Orlando, that you can see in the bottom right there, that was embedded with the team. Whenever you're working with professional sports, it's very important to have a very good relationship. You need to have it with the players, have it with the medical staff, the coaches, the trainers. Everyone needs to be really on board and believe in what you're doing. If you don't have the trust, they're not going to listen to any of your recommendations. So it's really important to build the relationships first. That's really key. So when we're looking at personalization, a couple of the key aspects we look at first is thinking about what are the athletes losing, what type of sweat losses are they having. We think about fluid losses, we think about their electrolyte losses. Lourdes mentioned sodium being key, and then she also presented the fat max. So we think about what type of fuel are these athletes utilizing, because then we're going to be able to take both of those characteristics, build a nutritional plan, knowing for that individual athlete what their needs are for that specific training, competition, the environment as well. Once we have that, we can provide them with their specialized formula, their plan that they're going to have, their nutrition plan for those occasions. So when we're talking about fluid loss or sweat loss, we need to think about what we're doing with these athletes before they're actually going out on the pitch, as well as during the actual activity. And then lastly, after the activity, there are several measures that we're going to make with them as well. Now, you saw a little bit of urine that Lourdes presented this morning, and there's going to be a little bit more of that, because it's actually a great way to determine hydration status in the athletes. And just for someone that doesn't have a scientific background, one easy way to determine if hydration status is okay is looking at urine color. So you can see, well, it's kind of hard to see in the screen here, but the one on the right is more of a lemonade, a pale yellow color. That would be more hydrated, but more of an apple juice, darker color would be more dehydrated. But we're actually using an instrument, a refractometer, to measure the actual specific gravity to get more accurate on the hydration status of the athletes, and we're doing that before they actually go on the field. So when we're measuring making this type of measure with the athletes, we're getting a whole host of the whole squad before the team or before the practice, and it would look something like this. And it's hard to see once again, but there are many differences. So we're going to look at each player and see what each player's status is before practice. Each of these bars represent one individual player, and if the bar reaches up to the top in the red, they're in the dehydrated area. If it's on the lower end, they're well hydrated before. As I mentioned in the study before, we know dehydration has a negative effect on performance. So if the athlete's dehydrated before they even get on the field or on the pitch, it's going to be issues from the beginning, and we're not even yet thinking about what they're going to do during activity to replace their fluid losses. Lourdes mentioned how we do that with a sweat test and body weight measures and the patches that we're actually placing on the athletes that are collecting electrolyte losses. It's very important to gather all this information to give good recommendations. So what we found is that athletes actually fail to match some of their fluid losses during activity We know that once athletes get beyond about 2% of their body weight loss, so that's where you start to see issues with performance. And this line represents if they matched exactly by drinking what they were losing in their sweat. And if they're above the line, they overdrank. You can see that one of the athletes actually overdrank, whereas everyone under the line did not meet their needs. Now, having a little bit, like I said, up to maybe 2% is okay, but once you start dropping down and getting lower, more dehydrated, that's where the issues are going to come in. Now, the reason for athletes not really knowing what they should be drinking is that we see a very large variation in their actual sweat rates or their fluid losses. This figure, once again, showing individual players. If the line is higher, they have a very high sweat rate. If the line is lower, lower sweat rate. So you can see just on this one team, there are a lot of differences for this one practice condition, for this one training environment that they're in. I've tested some athletes, up to 70 athletes at a time in the same environment, and have found that their sweat rates have actually ranged from about a half a liter an hour to more than 2.5 liters an hour. So if you give an average, the person's could be very dehydrated or very overhydrated. That's why averages do not work in sweat losses. Now when we're looking at the electrolyte content, same story. You can see once again, some people are high, some people are low. Once again, being variable, we need to understand exactly what that athlete is losing. Going back to that group that I worked with, that was over 70 athletes, we saw some losses of about 3/4 of a gram of sodium chloride per hour and over 10 grams per hour. That's a huge range once again. Averages just don't work. You need to personalize for the individual athlete and for the environment that they're in. Now that kind of covers the sweat type area. Nutritional preferences, I'm just going to have one slide discussing the actual preferences that we try to collect data from the athletes on to determine what they should be doing. So everyone is different. Some people have different tastes. They maybe like things stronger tasting, lighter tasting. Maybe they like to drink a lot at one time, or maybe frequently they like to have small amounts. If a liquid is colder, athletes will typically drink more. So it's important to understand what are the likes, because if you give an athlete a plan and they don't like to do that method that you're giving them, they're not going to do it. So it's important to take in all the information together and not just give a generic plan to the athlete. So on the other side of the equation, the fat max, understanding the fuel utilization. Lourdes described the test. I'm not going to go into the test in detail. But in general, we see with exercise intensity, you have an increase in carbohydrate use in general and a decrease in fat use. But as Lourdes mentioned, there are differences in athletes once again. These are two different athletes. She showed a similar figure earlier. It's important to understand, is this person, do they rely more on carbohydrate? Do they rely on fat? Because then what you're going to give them is going to be based on what their individual needs are. Finishing it up with their report. Needs to be very easy. As Lourdes mentioned, color coding things, understanding for the athletes to break it down and make it simple, and giving it to their trainer, their coach, the medical staff, so that there's an understanding and accountability on the team. So with everyone being different, it's important to take the next step and really understand, okay, we have all these differences, how are we going to deliver for the needs of the athlete? And I'd like to play a short video showing a particular system that we've developed that we use with the athletes to deliver their nutritional plan, specifically their carbohydrate, fluid, and electrolytes during exercise. If you could play the video, please.
Run, sweat, and fight for the win. Harder and faster for glory. Tear down the wall that holds you in. Break through the dark and shout for glory. Run, sweat, and fight for the win. Harder and faster for glory. Tear down the wall that holds you in. Break through the dark and shout for glory. Shout for glory.
Okay, so you can see the system that we're using and the specialized equipment that we've developed, and I'll go into a little bit more detail on it. But when we worked with the team, once we got to the understanding of what the individual needs were, then we were able to look at, okay, how much fluid, carbohydrate, electrolytes do they need? What's the balance? Because you can think of if you have one type of carbohydrate in a beverage, for instance, and you're giving a half a liter, you're giving a liter, you're going to double the amount of carbohydrate. Maybe you don't want to do that because the person has a very high sweat rate, so you might give a different concentration of carbohydrate in that particular occasion. So these pods are actually concentrated formulas that are going to be introduced into that smart vessel, and each athlete is going to have their own recommendation. So that smart vessel where the pods introduced into the bottom there gets released and mixed with the water that's in the vessel to get it to the right concentration. We also have a cap that's on that that's going to connect and send the information to the iPad that you saw. So that's going to give the direct information of what the athlete's actually drinking at the time, and it's going to be to the person, maybe it's a trainer, maybe it's the coach, who's ever responsible for the nutrition of the particular athlete. The whole system together kind of looks something like this, where we kind of showed the scales before. Once again, you remember the scales we use just for before and after exercise to see what the athlete's fluid losses are. The bottles, each player has a different bottle assigned to them. All the information is transmitted to the iPad. Once again, making it very simple, color-coded. The coach trainer is going to see the list of all the players. Maybe they have some problem players that they're going to keep at the top and pay attention to, and maybe it's going to color code and turn red if there are issues. They're not matching their hydration plan or their carbohydrate plan during that particular training session. Now I'd like to play one last video that shows how we use this with the Brazilian national team, and it really describes also our athlete services model, and with the great team here in Mexico and what they're doing. We keep that consistent throughout the world, so whenever we're working with teams, we're doing it at the top level and providing a similar service to all. If you could play the video, please.
When Gatorade partnered with one of the world's top football clubs, the Brazilian national team, elite athlete service was elevated to an entirely new level. The Brazilian team opened the door, granting Gatorade scientists unprecedented access.
Together with the CBF team, we developed research on heat stress and dehydration to see how the body responds during exercise.
Each player received his own personalized bottle and customized product formulation through the introduction of the Drinkfinity pods and the hydration tracking system.
Hoje, vários jogadores, quando vão para a seleção brasileira, cada leva seus kits.
The player just comes with this pod that contains his specific formula, plugs it in, shake it, mixed with water, and he's ready to go. This is the technology we are using. This bottle has a microchip in it that sends information in real time to the coach.
Gatorade added further support by providing the Brazilian team with their own fuel bar to access sports nutrition products, education, and insights. The partnership with the Brazilian national team represents a big step, but it's just the first step as elite athlete service grows on a global scale. Gatorade will expand the roster, working with more teams in a variety of sports. Emerging technology platforms will be leveraged as never before. Sports fuel personalization is the present and future vision. Improved athletic performance will always be the ultimate goal.
So you can see there, it's all about the athlete. Coming back to our mission, how can we help the athlete? Can we get that 1%? Can we help them win that match? Can we help them get to the line faster, beat their competition? If you're interested in more information, we do have a website. The gssiweb.org is our website in English that has a wide variety of information. We have some select information on the Mexican website below as well. On this website, it's mainly geared for or focused for the people working with the athletes. We have articles, Sports Science Exchange articles. There are many of these on the Mexico website in Spanish as well, but specific topics written by experts in the field, so researchers in the field. Then we have short videos giving information on a particular topic, a 1 minute, 1.5 minute video, providing the information from the expert. Follow me on Twitter, there's some information there, and we also have a hashtag GSSI XP. Next week, there's a very large sports science conference in San Diego in the United States, and starting on Tuesday, there will be a lot of information, so if you're interested in sports nutrition, make sure you follow that hashtag next Tuesday, and you'll learn quite a bit more by the experts in the field. Thank you very much for your time, I appreciate it.